think one of the key things that is important to actually state here is that MDBs actually have established systems. They've been in this business for decades, right? Some MDBs are as old as 70 years. Some are as old as 40 years. On average, you will find a whole lot of MDBs that have been in operation for decades, right? So that long-term, long year of international development experience is so vital. And aside from that, is actually the systems that we have established systems. So this, the due diligence system that you will typically don't find in private sector and in commercial banks, you'll find them in MDBs, right? And that's why most times, even private sector players do use MDBs as implementers of some of their interventions when they provide their financing. And because, of course, MDBs are industry leaders when it comes to providing development finance, whether it's climate or non-climate related. But also is the fact that the concessional financing, there are a lot of highly competitive financing rates that you get from development banks that you will not get in commercial banks. And aside from the fact that you get very cheap money coming from these banks, is the fact that there are a lot of instruments. For instance, we have COVID-19, we have COVID bond that is coming, that we have actually coming from MDBs, right? So we have a whole lot of different instruments that are tailored. We have policy-based lending, which I'm going to show later. We have, aside from loans, right, there are tens of instruments that MDBs can actually generate based on the context and the needs of the member country or the client that we actually serve. And also is the fact that that resource mobilizing power is always there. When you see private sector players going into a deal, you'll see some of them having preference that when we have an MDB on board, then it gives us more confidence of the process, of the transparency and things like that. But aside from those two, concessional financing and the established system, is also the fact that countries do like long-term strategic partnership, all right? MDBs, they are owned by these countries. So it's not a business of, okay, I'm here for 5 years and I'm going to be out after 5 years. I'm going to be here for the long haul, right? So because the banks are owned by these countries. So you have that long-term strategic, long-term horizon when it comes to engagement between multilateral development banks and the countries. So that alone in itself gives that level of confidence that, okay, they can commit a whole lot of activities to multilateral development banks to do. And also is the fact that this is one of the plus that all MDBs actually have over commercial banks, and is the ability to be able to de-risk certain sectors. I always give this example. There was a project that we were financing in a very remote part in sub-Saharan Africa, where private sector players never wanted to actually go to actually do those solar farms, right? So the only reason, and the reason was that the needed infrastructure, the road network, to actually connect those very remote rural areas where those massive power plants would be constructed were never there. So nobody wanted to actually invest that additional financing to the high cost of actually financing some of the project that they're doing. So we played that role of de-risking that particular sector by providing the needed infrastructure to set the ground for all private sector players that came. So aside from the fact that you've got cheap money coming into the country, of course, this cheap money is limited because it's actually resources coming mainly from the member countries, right? All the member countries to support member countries also. So it's like a resource pooling platform, but something like that mainly. People bring their resources and then it's actually used to help a common cause among member countries that are unable to actually meet some of their development obligations. So you see that de-risking ability for us to be able to go into a sector or a country and help de-risk sectors that you will never find private sector players there. The whole idea is for us to be able to crowd in more private sector players, because we know that private sector players, that's where the money is. But private sector players are always very careful when it comes to taking risk, right? So we deal mainly with the sovereign side. We also have private sector arm, but by helping to de-risk those sector actually gives room for private sector players to be able to actually come and to actually do that. And also is a policy support and reforms that we do. We don't just go to countries and provide finance. That will make us a commercial bank. So we go not just with financing, but we also go with some other packages, including reforms, including how you can actually get your national procurement policy right, how you can actually get some sector policy right. And that's where you'll find some of those instruments like policy-based lending. How do you ensure you remove subsidy to be able to actually make those sectors viable? So those sort of instruments are very useful in helping countries reform sectors that have typically been locked into a traditional lifestyle that makes it difficult to actually have any meaningful development success. And also the last part is the multilateralism. Countries would typically look to MDBs because of the fact that it's not owned by just one country. is owned by multiple stakeholders, right? It's owned by everyone that is a shareholder in the bank. And this joint ownership gives trust, it gives confidence that, okay, even if the bank actually dictates what I should do, it's not dictating on the basis of a particular shareholder, it's dictating on the basis of what is global best practice in that particular field or sector. So that level of trust is always there when it comes to multilateral development banks. And the last thing is that because we are always scrutinized by the public, because we are public institutions, we are owned by these shareholders, the countries that are shareholders. So there's a lot of public scrutiny, even in the amount of financing that we provide to address climate change. Every year, we get a whole lot of NGOs coming after us as MDBs on how much we're actually dedicating to addressing some very vital development issues that is top on the agenda of our member countries. So these are things that will always make countries to always want to typically prefer. But it's just a nutshell of some of the things that you'll typically get. As I said earlier, that these are some of the instruments that we sometimes use. There are a whole lot of them, but these are the typical ones that we use for climate finance, from line of credit to green bonds to policy-based lending, and a whole lot of them, working capital, depending on what is actually suitable for the client. And if you look at our report that came out in August, it said the bulk of our finance actually went to investment loan, and then we have policy-based financing. Not all MDBs do policy-based financing, but a significant of MDBs actually do, and lines of credit and things like that.